Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. We're here today with special guest, Eileen Santos Rosete, who's here to share with us her new book, To Tend and to Hold, Honoring Our Bodies, Our Needs, and Our Grief Through Pregnancy and Infant Loss. So is there a better way to support women who have had a pregnancy loss? Well, today's guest is going to share with us just that. So Eileen Santos Rosete holds a Master of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy from Northwestern University and a certificate as a Dawn International Postpartum Doula, trauma-informed yoga teacher, and grief educator. Her brand, Our Sacred Women, is known for its elevated offerings that help women feel seen, heard, and honored. So welcome to the show, Eileen Santos Rosete.
Thank you, Marianne. It's an honor to be here.
My goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. What has prompted you to write about such a very personal and touching topic?
Well, I think, as is the case with many folks who find themselves doing grief work, there is some personal experience that draws them to the field, and that was very much the situation with me. I experienced 2 pregnancy losses after giving birth to my first living child, and this was a number of years ago. And though the culture is shifting now, where you see more stories being shared openly, whether it's high profile folks or just the everyday person on Instagram. Back then, really wasn't talked about, pregnancy loss or infant loss. And at the time, I felt very much alone, as is a very common experience, and unsure of what my options were, and really taken by surprise, Marianne, that I had to birth these pregnancies. It wasn't until I was in the throes of laboring with my first pregnancy loss that I realized I was literally on the toilet, Marianne, on the toilet having contractions. And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm giving birth, I'm laboring, because I had done it once before with my eldest daughter. And so I knew, I knew what was involved with laboring. And just the fact that I didn't realize that I would be birthing this pregnancy really drove home the need for me to help others know, so that they weren't caught off guard, so that they could feel more mentally, emotionally, physically prepared for that threshold. And so really drawing from the pain I felt at the time and the longings I felt, I really wanted to feel held and to feel just loved through all of that pain. And unfortunately, I was met with comments from really dear friends, that comments that are very common, such as, oh, at least it was early, or, it was only 10 weeks along, it wasn't a baby. And granted, each person brings their own meaning to the pregnancy that they're carrying. So some may feel it's a baby, some may not. And for me, I felt like it was a child that I very much wanted. So to hear that from a really dear friend was hard. And so I wanted very much to write a book I could have used all those years ago. One that would help me know my options, that would normalize what I was feeling, and help me to know that this experience of pregnancy loss, and for those who are going through infant loss, that this is both a universal experience as much as it is a very unique personal experience.
Well, I'm so sorry for your losses. That's just heartbreaking.
Thank you. Thank you for your condolences. And that this is a, prime example of what I hope to do with the book, is help others know that for folks to know, to do what you just did, Marianne, to offer their condolences. And I think that acknowledgement in and of itself can be so powerful and so healing.
I was so touched in how you started your book off a moment of silence.
Ah, yes.
Oh my gosh. And I felt like that really puts things in perspective. And you mentioned, for the moms who are experiencing a womb loss, I think that that is something that many women can really identify with as we've been talking. It's something that at least is being talked about now where it wasn't really before.
And yeah, just to quickly define womb loss, that's a term that I really resonate with because it feels more tangible to me. Like this loss is something that happens within our wombs, literally within our uterus. If the pregnancy ends internally that way, or it's if an infant is born alive and then that dies soon after, and that's infant loss, it's still so intimately tied to your womb. And I very much wanted to center those of us who've experienced pregnancy and infant loss with our bodies, to center us in the conversation when so often, and this goes for pregnancies that end with living children too, the attention shifts to the baby. And those of us who carry these pregnancies often feel forgotten after a birth. Um, so I very much wanted to center those of us who experience this with our bodies and to help all of us know that we too are postpartum after pregnancy and infant loss, that you were pregnant, your body released the pregnancy in some way at any point in gestation, and to be in that state after a birth is to be in the postpartum period. And you deserve the same things that all who give birth deserve, whether it's nourishing food, healing touch, emotional support. So I'm hoping with this book, Marianne, that to plant the seed in the world that you too are postpartum, and with more and more postpartum resources emerging these days, that people will know, okay, these are some things I can do for this person with an added sensitivity to the grief that they're experiencing, if they feel grief for that loss.
In your book, you really emphasize the importance of centering one's needs after pregnancy and infant loss. I know you've mentioned a few already. But what are some ways that we can honor our bodies and the experience that we're going through?
Such a good question. I think it begins with slowing down, which can be hard if you're in a moment, if you're in that acute phase of experiencing a pregnancy and infant loss. It can be hard to slow down if you're needing to make decisions right away. Um, that said, if you can even offer yourself a few breaths, just a quick moment to slow down, to invite quiet, and to listen. When I was teaching, I'm a trauma informed yoga instructor as well, and often when I was teaching yoga both at a yoga studio just outside Chicago, this was in my 20s, and also at a treatment center, for a residential treatment center for women and girls, I would often, if not always, we begin by approaching each student and asking them, first, do you have any injuries that are helpful for me to know about? And secondly, what is your body calling for in this moment? So if we can ask ourselves that question, even like right now, Marianne, if I were to ask you, Marianne, what is your body calling for in this moment?
It would say rest.
Ah, me too. Me too. Yes. I think if we can give ourselves a pause, even if it's, see, I asked you that question, Marianne, and when between my asking and your answering was just a few seconds, but that can be enough for our bodies to speak. I mean, I believe they're really constantly speaking to us. It's whether or not we have the capacity to, or, have the wherewithal to stop and listen, to pause or slow down and listen. It's constantly communicating to us our deepest needs, I feel.
How do you hope your work helps women to articulate their experiences with pregnancy and infant loss? Because I know grief can be so overwhelming, and during those times, it would seem like it would be tough sometimes to find the words.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So my background is as a marriage and family therapist as well. And the reason I went into that field at all was because of a therapist I had worked with in our very first session. And this is me showing up with so much angst and confusion about relationships and myself and where I was going with life in my early 20s. She said a word at some point. She was reflecting back to me what she was hearing me communicate. And she reflected back to me with a word, a single word. And I can't I can't tell you what that word is. But what I do remember was hearing that word and just feeling like time stopped and this deep body breath, like, yes, I felt so seen with that word. And so that really taught me the power of language and the power of knowing words to communicate our internal landscape and what we're feeling. And literally after that session, I called a girlfriend and I said to her, I'm going to become a marriage and family therapist because I want others to feel what I just felt. It was that powerful for me. I spent a year applying, like getting all my things ready to apply to be a good candidate. And I went to grad school and all that. That has all been transmuted into the book as well. That felt experience in my life of the power of language and the power of words. And so I share in my book, you may have seen at the beginning, a chart with a number of terms that readers can use to describe their experience of pregnancy and infant loss, with the caveat that what matters most is what is meaningful to you, the reader. That you can look at this chart, you can take it in. If anything resonates, great. If nothing does, that's fine too. And you can find your own way. But to plant seeds for what is possible and to really emphasize that we don't have to settle for what exists. In my book, I talk about the term miscarriage and how it's not a term I resonate with much anymore because of that prefix mis, which is tied to mistake. For me, it seems miscarriage seems to imply that something wrong, when so often pregnancy loss, especially early pregnancy loss, is beyond our control, which is hard to really embody that understanding when you feel like, well, this pregnancy was in my body, so I should have more control over it, right? But so yeah, I offer that chart with a number of terminology. And what's interesting, Mariana, that I hope more people come to know is that there really is no consensus with terms related to reproductive loss, perinatal loss, pregnancy, infant loss. All those terms are used interchangeably. So with between providers within a certain state, the same country, and across the world, the term miscarriage usually refers to an early pregnancy loss. In the United States, usually between conception to 12 weeks or so. Um, in other countries, the term stillbirth, which is a loss after that 12-week mark in the United States, at least. In other countries, it could be further down the line in gestation. So all that to say that, there's no hard and fast rules about language. And we can advocate for the language that resonates for us, that engenders dignity. There's a lot, actually, of language within the field of reproductive health as it pertains to women that's very demeaning, actually. A common term I'll hear from my postpartum doula clients is incompetent cervix. This is when your cervix begins to open prematurely, early, and so there's a higher chance of a pregnancy loss being experienced in that case, or stillbirth, or infant loss. And I mean, how do you feel when you hear the term incompetent cervix?
I don't think any woman deserves to hear that. I think that's really poor languaging, and they need to look at that in a new way.
And it's, Marianne, I know it's poor languaging, and it's like standard in medicine, in Western medicine. I had a postpartum doula client tell me, we were having a phone session, and she repeatedly referred to her incompetent cervix. My incompetent cervix, she would say. And every time she said that, my heart broke. And, if we think about gender and gender politics, it's hard to come up with an equivalent for the male body or for male reproductive health. If if I can go down that line a little bit more, because I've been talking about this with colleagues, it's when it comes to like erectile dysfunction, we don't put the problem onto the person and their body. We say it's erectile dysfunction. The problem lies within the functioning, right? We don't say you have an incompetent body part to male body folks. So it would be really amazing to see a reevaluation of language when it comes to reproductive health for women and birthing people. And yeah, there's layers. There's layers. I think that question was a good one and a big one.
Well, on that note, we're going to pause here for a quick break. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
Are you an author, speaker, or expert who is looking for more publicity? Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up for free interview requests from shows looking for guests. Radio Guest List is the #1 free booking resource for radio, podcasts, and TV talk shows who are looking for experts like you right now. Visit radioguestlist.com and sign up today to get the visibility you deserve.
There comes a moment when you realize you're somewhere special. When you discover that each beautiful creature that you see has been rescued from a life of absolute horror and brought to this incredibly free place. Here's where their lives were forever changed and where yours will as well. Discover over 500 tigers, bears, and lions at the brand new visitor center at the Wild Animal Sanctuary just outside Denver. For more information, visit wildanimalsanctuary.org. Discover true freedom at the Wild Animal Sanctuary.
It's one thing to become attached to your perfect home, but what do you do when that home becomes attached to you? A family in dire need of a fresh start, a mysterious house tied to the past. Buried deep within the foundation of the old Far Hill Manor lies a centuries-old secret. Dark forces or something stronger just waiting to be discovered. Caretaker, a supernatural thriller by breakout authors R.J. Halpert.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Welcome back to Moments with Mary Ann. We're here today with special guest, Eileen Santos Rosete, who's here to share with us her new book, To Tend and to Hold, Honoring Our Bodies, Our Needs, and Our Grief Through Pregnancy and Infant Loss. Can you share with us unique challenges faced by those that are experiencing postpartum and grieving simultaneously?
Yeah, so if I may offer some definition. So in my work as a grief educator, leading grief support groups with a nonprofit in Los Angeles called Our House, I've come to really define grief simply as a response you feel to a loss that is meaningful to you. Meaningful doesn't necessarily mean you absolutely love that person 100%, because that's not necessarily the case. You can have mixed feelings about a loss, and the loss can be a death-related loss or a non-death related loss. An example can be another form of womb loss is a hysterectomy. Your uterus, your womb is literally removed from you. So you did not die, and you also experience a physical loss. So that's what I mean by a non-death loss. So grief, again, is a response you feel to a loss that is meaningful. To be in a postpartum period, postpartum simply means after birth. So after you've given birth or released a pregnancy, whether it's ended in a living child or not, you are in what's called a postpartum period. That's a time of huge physical, emotional, relational even changes. So your body goes through a lot of hormonal shifts in pregnancy. And after your body releases a pregnancy, those hormones are shifting once again. And depending on how long you've gestated, there may be added physical factors. So you might have someone who's gestated, excuse me, almost full term or full term. So beyond 30 weeks. So their womb has expanded beyond the size of a watermelon. They've been going through all those very visible physical changes. And then to be on the other side of the birth and to be postpartum, they need that much more time to heal for their body to return to a non-pregnant state. So there's layers for my readers. It's you are postpartum because you are post-birth. And that is hard. That is hard, period. Then you're layering onto that grief. If you feel grief for your loss, if you feel a response to this loss, it can be hard. A challenge can be, what do you do? What do you do after the birth, after you've released the pregnancy? Because it may not occur to people that they're postpartum because they don't have a living child to hold or to show for the pregnancy. And yet they are. So I hope that readers understand that. And then maybe you access postpartum resources with the knowledge that they're typically written for those who are postpartum with living children. So that can be a challenge too, is you may be accessing resources, and those resources are not necessarily written to be grief and trauma sensitive. And I say trauma sensitive because reproductive loss, like pregnancy and infant loss, can feel deeply traumatic. And by traumatic, I mean anything that has left an experience that has left a deep impression that makes it difficult for you to feel safe and at ease in your body. So if you can imagine, Marianne, that pregnancy and infant loss, it's so tied to our bodies, those of us who go through it, and to have this experience leave a deep impression that makes it hard to feel safe in our bodies is such a common experience. So unfortunately for my readers, there's layers. There's the being postpartum, grieving, and then also feeling traumatized, carrying trauma from an experience that can leave you feeling hypervigilant, like constantly aware of things that may put you at harm, that may harm you, and that makes it really hard to rest.
What do you believe needs to change so that we can better support survivors?
Yeah, that's a layered question too. If we consider the context of where we live in this country and access to reproductive health care varying so much. Because the care that you need to tend to reproductive loss, like pregnancy and infant loss, is very restricted in some parts of our country now and even criminalized. So what needs to change is systemic changes as far as allowing people to get the health care they need to manage loss. And if I can make that a little more concrete, and I'll use a personal example and one that I use openly. Um, when I experienced pregnancy loss the first time, there was no longer a heartbeat. So what was growing within me was no longer alive. And with my OBGYN at the time, we co-created a plan, which was for me to allow my body 2 weeks to try to release the pregnancy on its own. And if that didn't happen, then I would take medication to encourage labor and to help me release that pregnancy to avoid the risk of infection if that fetal tissue were to remain in me. So we did that. I gave myself 2 weeks. And that was a hard 2 weeks of knowing that I was carrying around what I felt was my dead baby in my body. It was a very surreal experience. And at that 2 week mark, not having released the pregnancy, I took the medication that encouraged labor. So my experience of pregnancy loss was both what they would call a spontaneous miscarriage, it's your body ending that pregnancy on its own, and in a form of medication abortion. Abortion, I feel like that term is very, divisive. But the care you need, that the care I needed to help my body release the pregnancy, it's care that's not easily accessible anymore for everyone in this country. And so I share that personal example to say that it's so nuanced, it's so complex. So my experience of pregnancy loss required different kinds of support. And so to answer your question, what needs to change? We need healthcare that supports our healing, our releasing of the pregnancy and our healing. And I think we need softer, more compassionate language when it comes to talking about forms of pregnancy and infant loss and talking about those of us who experience it. Again, and we started our conversation with the topic of language and the power of language. And I'm hoping with the book to model that it's not just giving information, but really modeling and inviting a felt experience in the moment of reading of what is possible for our world. As you may have seen, I open each chapter with a story meant to be comforting, because so often in books about this topic, many are memoir and many share really hard, trauma-filled stories of pregnancy and infant loss, which can be really affirming for some. For those like me, I felt like my trauma was enough to hold, and it was hard for me to read and take in other stories. So I open with stories of comfort. And these stories very much show what's possible, that what may not occur to us as something we deserve. So I'm hoping those stories plant seeds to help readers know what they deserve and what needs to change. Like, this should be second nature for people to know to bring you food or to send you gift cards for food, to support you in the ways we support others who are going through a death or a tremendous loss. So to create guidelines so people know how to respond compassionately when they learn that someone has experienced womb loss.
So, to kind of piggyback on that, do you think that that's part of the problem when it comes to languaging as well? Is people just, they're very well intentioned, but they're really speaking from their own experience and really don't understand what may be appropriate or not appropriate to say?
What comes to mind is um, often folks who have not experienced pregnancy and infant loss. Their hearts may very much be in the right place in terms of wanting to offer comfort. And yet it's hard to know. And I speak from my own experience. It's hard to know until you've gone through it. Just the depth of the experience can bring you into the depth of pain, the depth of confusion, the depth of frustration at not being understood. So, I mean, yes and no. Those who have experienced pregnancy and infant loss with their bodies may very well speak from their experience and offer words that they felt were helpful to them, but land differently for the person receiving in that moment. And so in the book, I do have a section with samples of language, sampling of language you can offer to yourself or to others. And I offer an invitation there too that you might ask someone to read these out loud and see what actually feels comforting to you.
I was so impressed with the grounding exercises that you have throughout the book and then different teas that people can make for self-care. Why was it so important for you to include those as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Marianne. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm bringing so many parts of myself to this book, to the writing of it. So, as a marriage and family therapist, a trauma informed yoga instructor, a grief educator, a postpartum doula. So, all these parts of me were showing up as I was writing. And, and that was a very intentional choice to offer more or less a short paragraph with information and then follow that with a grounding exercise. And in therapy, we call that titration. It's this idea that you allow the client to feel into the difficult feeling a little bit, but not too much. And you allow them, you with them, allow them to help them to come into a more grounded state so that you avoid a state of overwhelm. So it's just a little bit of exposure and then coming back to a sense of grounding. A little bit of exposure and coming back to a sense of grounding. So I wanted the book to embody that. And also, what comes to mind in thinking of your question, a really close friend of mine who's also a mother of living children. She told me as I was writing this I've spent 4 years writing this book. And in the early years, she told me, make it short because we're too tired to read. We're too tired to read after having children or after being pregnant. And I felt that in my own body with living children and with loss that you are so overcome physically, emotionally, spiritually, that it can be hard to read a book. And so I wanted to insert those grounding practices. So it felt like a moment to breathe, a moment to rest, so that the book feels doable. It feels, not overwhelming.
So, what role does community play in supporting those that have gone through a loss?
Community is so important. As much as my book talks about what I call self tending, a term I use in lieu of self care because I wanted a term that felt more sacred. And when you think of tending, you often think of tending a garden, something that's a process that's slow and gentle and oftentimes soothing. So with self-tending, I wanted to help readers to know there's so much you can do to self-tend and to care for yourself in a way you may not feel tended to by others. So there's that piece. And my hope is that as readers experience this for themselves, that they'll be equipped with a toolbox, a growing toolbox of ways they can support others. So a ripple effect, if you may. And that in that ripple effect, that the community of people who can meet perinatal loss with grief and trauma sensitivity will grow. And community is also essential if you think of systems changes. If we think of the medical community, I was very caught off guard, but then again, I wasn't surprised. In training to be a marriage and family therapist, we don't talk about perinatal loss. And it's amazing if you think of how we all come from someone's womb. And then I learned from my friends who are in the medical field, whether it's nursing or OBs, like this knowledge of how to be trauma and grief informed with those who experience pregnancy and infant loss. It's not woven into the curriculum. You have to search this information out. So if we think about the power of community, having this information that's in my book and that's in many other places as well, folding that in, normalizing that information into the training that those healthcare and healing providers who serve pregnant people, the trainings they go through to have that integrated, that could be such huge change that leads to big ripple effects that can help create the cultural shift in equipping our society to know how to hold space for this kind of loss with compassion and also with reverence, with a deep respect for how hard these processes of conception, conceiving, gestating, laboring, birthing, and postpartum healing are. Those are all very distinct processes that we go through. And to go through all of that without a living child, if you had wanted one, or even if you didn't want one or you weren't sure if you wanted one, you may still feel grief. And so a reverence, a deep respect for that whole journey. So yeah, community can be so powerful in mirroring back to us that we deserve to feel seen and held through our pain and through our grief.
Now, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but the grounding practices that you have within your book, what is the significance of doing that? Why would we ground?
Yeah, so it can be so easy to feel overcome or overwhelmed with emotions, with really intense feeling states. Whether you are in an acute grief period or many years after and feeling, we often use the term triggered in therapy, which I really don't resonate with anymore, especially given all the tragedies with gun violence in our country. And what I use in the book is the word activate or activating. So someone who's gone through pregnancy and infant loss and who has experienced that loss as traumatic, they can be activated and by certain things they read. And so I really wanted to offer these grounding practices in case that were to happen. Like if they were feeling big feelings that they didn't necessarily, that they had tools at hand. It's just the next paragraph or 2 paragraphs down is another grounding practice. So you could feel, you can come back to a sense of being in the here and now rather than being swept up in a spiral of whatever it is that you're feeling. And that's important because to be able to live our lives meaningfully. Asks of us to make intentional decisions, intentional choices about what comes next. And it can be hard to be intentional when you're flooded with feelings, when you're caught up in what could have been, in thoughts of what could have been. And so grounding is essential. It's essential to help you slow down, to help you pause, and then to help you listen to what your body is calling for. And your body will guide you to what you need most. And I'm not saying that's an easy process. Learning or allowing yourself to slow down, to pause, and to listen can be very hard, as simple as that sounds. My invitation to readers is to go at your own pace. Know that there's no right or wrong way to grieve or to go through postpartum healing. That it's all unique to you, and you get to choose. You get to exercise choice, especially if you've gone through a form of pregnancy and infant loss where you didn't feel you had choice. You didn't have agency. So I fill my book with many opportunities to exercise agency for that reason.
Well, Eileen, where can our readers and listeners connect with you and learn more about your book, To Tend and to Hold?
Yes, you can find more about me and pre-order my book online at my website, EileenSantosRosete.com. That's EileenSantosRosete.com, or on Instagram at our sacred SACRED women, Our Sacred Women.
Well, Eileen, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm honored. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eileen. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, To Tend and to Hold, honoring our bodies, our needs, and our grief through pregnancy and infant loss. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.